Hi, everyone. I'm Gary Berman, host of the Cyber Hero Adventures Show. Our mission is to shine the light on the unsung cyber heroes who toil in anonymity to keep us safe at work, at home, at school. If it sounds like I'm using a little bit of superhero language, that's because we do superhero comics to say thank you to these unsung cyber heroes. Because the only time you hear about cybersecurity or hacking is when the threat actors and criminals win. Well, not anymore. And what a great group of cyber heroes we have today, beginning with Keith Fuentes from Samsung. Hey, Keith, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Gary?
You know, it is so good to see you again, and I mean that when I say it because you were the very first person I ever spoke to um, uh, for almost 5 years ago at a Wall Street Journal cybersecurity conference, and I don't know what's wrong with you, but you believed me.
Yeah, your story was pretty unique. And to be honest, when we first met and you were talking, I don't know if you recall in that cybersecurity show we went to in New York, we were my company was hosting it, and I was the keynote to open the ceremonies. And our first speakers were an FBI and CIA heads of cybersecurity, one for domestic, one for international. And it was interesting because their whole presentation talked about how there's a lot of bad actors and they're syncing together, they're working together, they share, they have different forums in which they can provide information amongst each other. And unfortunately, when it comes to public corporations, or what we would call the good guys, they're not sharing, and they're hiding facts. And I thought that speech was really powerful. And I think it's how it introduced us, because at the end of their speech, you were the one person who stood up. And the fact that you're 6'7", so when you stand up, everybody notices. But when you actually speak
Wait,
to the
wait, wait, wait. Time out, time out, time out, time out. Okay, I do the humor and the comedy. You focus on substance. That way we stay in our lanes, okay?
I got it, no problem. So to that point was, as you stood up and raised your hand and talked about how wouldn't it be great if there was a opportunity for corporations to share data with not necessarily divulging their company secrets or jeopardizing their stock price, and maybe that way the good actors could kind of collaborate. And it struck me as very powerful. And so from my background, for the last 9 years being with Samsung and working on their security side from a B2B mobility perspective, I thought it was pretty brilliant. And that's where I think it's led us to this point where we started talking then, and we've continued talking now for 5 years.
Indeed, and whether you like it or not, you're my friend. So speaking of my friends, here's Scott Schober. He's CEO of BBS Systems, Berkeley Electronic. Say it.
Berkeley Varitronics Systems, or you could say BVS for short.
Exactly. Scott was also sort of an early friend, colleague. He's a trusted advisor of mine too. So anything, smart that you hear coming from the show is in large part attributable to him and people like him. So thanks so much for being here, Scott.
Yeah, great to be here, Gary.
Indeed. And Scott is a subject matter expert on what we're talking about today, which is the future of 5G. And we're going to be delving into that. Can you share with our audience a little bit about the cool stuff you're doing there? You do a lot of physical work, which is different than most of our guests who are more in the software sort of side.
Yeah, absolutely. BVS is really a hardware company, which is somewhat unique. We're celebrating our 50th year this year, which is kind of exciting. And we've been making unique wireless threat detection tools really the past 10 years that focus that cyber agencies are using to stop any of the wireless threats that are out there. And prior to that, about the mid 80s or so, we were developing the first wireless test tools that were actually used to build out the early cellular networks, and then eventually 2G, 3G, 4G, and then brings us to today, the 5G. And we're still building 5G test tools to build out the network and improve it. So pretty exciting thing. So I kind of work in the area where wireless crosses cybersecurity, which is perfect for this discussion.
Indeed. And speaking of perfect for this discussion, we want to invite to the show Peter Elliott. Hey, Peter, how you doing?
Hey, Gary, good to see you.
So I don't know if you're a glutton for punishment. We met at the Rural Broadband Association. I gave a speech, and now here you are. Maybe you can share with our audience your important mission.
Absolutely, Gary, and thank you. It really was a pleasure to meet you and continue our friendship relationship. I think, as Keith said it brilliantly. What you do is so impressive, and
Thank
and
you.
it fits right in with what we're all about. We're an organization that's owned by telecommunications companies, and our whole mission is to provide an outlet of security and safety for them. And certainly over the last couple of years, cybersecurity has really stepped up to being something that's mission critical, not just for them, but for us to surprise that support for it. And when we start hearing about new things like 5G being introduced, people like Scott, if I heard him correctly, doing a lot of the testing and challenging of this new process, he becomes our best friend in the world, because it's one of the big fears we have is protecting from the unknown, which a new service can be.
Indeed. And how many members do you have in your organization?
Yeah, so the rural telecom sector really spans well over 1,000, and we have over 400 of those insured in our program.
Wow, that's incredible. And well, thanks for what you do. So we're going to jump right in. Here's an interesting kind of graphic that shows the kind of evolution of wireless technology. Scott, why don't you tell us kind of what we're looking at here?
Yeah, sure. Well, probably all of us remember back to that first generation of the cell phone, the picture of somebody standing there with the heavy brick phone, and you kind of wondered what in the world was that. And really the early days, and this was the early 90s when it started to actually become cell phones, started to go from our vehicles. If you remember the bag phones that were in our vehicles with the transceivers in the trunk, they were bulky, they were big, into the second generation where we're actually a handheld phone. And that was kind of amazing and breakthrough technology in the 90s. And a lot of companies jumped on board that second generation, which is really cellular, analog, very basic stuff there in the communications. And then as it migrated into the third generation, I think what started to happen was really kind of a divide. In the US, we saw really predominantly development of CDMA technologies. Companies such as Sprint and others really did well there with a spread spectrum signal that allowed lots of phones to be online at the same time, really efficient use of spectrum. And then into the other countries were predominantly really GSM, which was kind of a different type of technology that was utilized and still utilized today. And as it migrates into the third generation, into the fourth generation, it was predominantly LTE, which was more of a global footprint that people adopted. However, of course, with spectrum, everybody's not in the same pot of spectrum there. So there's a lot of variation in 4G LTE. And then, of course, 5G, even more so of a global standard. And it's, in a sense, most of the technology is reusing prior spectrum. So they don't have to go out and relicense it. But at the same time, new bands open up. And here in the States, certainly the FCC opened up a lot more spectrum in 5G, which in turn caused some of these challenges with band C that we'll probably talk about a little bit later with the world of avionics and interference and things. But really seeing the progression from the first generation, the early days of cellular, to where we are 5G, man, lots of changes and lots of improvements, which is really exciting.
Indeed. And Keith, you're in a pretty unique position, having worked with Samsung for all these years, to offer your opinion about the evolution, of this technology. And, what's your assessment about, how it's going?
Yeah, I mean, there's two ways I can view it. I mean, from a corporate standpoint, based in South Korea, they've been one of the forefronts of 5G. I think we saw that with the Winter Olympics in 2018, was it, in Seoul, where they were actually broadcasting 5G 4K video out of the Olympic Forum. And I had actually employees of mine that were sent there using the tech, and I got to see it firsthand. And it was pretty phenomenal. As a personal standpoint, when I look at it from a US perspective, I feel like it's been slow. And I'm a 5G user. I've had 5G devices for a long time. I've just recently had them online using 5G, and in certain cities it's great, but it's not necessarily at the level I had hoped it would be at this date and time. But I would say it's starting to rapidly grow. Where I thought it might have done 2 years ago, it's starting to do this year, in my opinion, or I should say last year, 2021. I personally got to experience it, if I'm just talking from my own individual experience. But
how forgive the interruption, what did you notice?
Well, the speeds, I mean, are second to none. So I mean, once you start to witness the speed capability, that's incredible. But from a business perspective, so I deal a lot with B2B customers, and that's business to business. And we've had customers, especially in the retail business, where they want to use augmented reality, and they want to be able to do things to give not just their shoppers a better experience, but also their employees. You're seeing a lot of these facilities go into kind of virtual warehouses as well as foot traffic, because when you have a pandemic, foot traffic can stop or it can slow down. So curbside and delivery becomes really important. And seeing augmented reality with high speed capabilities where individual employees of the store can use a phone, and it can just be connected to a 5G or a Wi-Fi connection if they have it, and be able to do things from a work as well as a consumer kind of in coordination is something I've actually been able to witness this year, and it's been pretty powerful. And so
is it amazing? I mean, is it like a game-changing kind of thing?
Yes, I mean it's second to none. It's 100 times faster than 4G when it's done right.
Oh, I didn't know that.
It makes a significant difference. And so again, augmented reality is an intensive solution if you're going to employ it, and it's something where the device has to have a lot of processor capability. But if you want to communicate seamlessly, so that a shopper, for example, could be walking around and just scanning, or not even scanning, it's really just viewing a large amount of product, but being able to gain specific data. That's pretty exciting, and it's unique. And once you've experienced it, it's hard to go back. I think that's what 4G did to 3G. If you get a chance and you use it and you apply it, and then you had to go back where you couldn't use it or apply it, it's difficult. So I think as this starts to go into more phases of life and more people see it or touch it and use it, they won't be able to live without it. That's the way I feel.
Indeed. And, Peter, there's a very interesting kind of graphic we came across. I'll just pop this up on the screen, which is the coverage. This is a map that emphasizes T-Mobile. We got that from their website, and it shows a couple of different things. And one that I'd like to ask you specifically about is just the notion of sort of urban versus, rural, coverage of 5G. That must be something that your members are, quite concerned or interested in, right?
Absolutely. There's such a push right now on broadband everywhere and a quality of service for everyone that not only is it a topic of discussion, but you see some of the rural companies starting to partner with some of the bigger companies out there to try to be able to provide these services. The people out in rural America certainly deserve that, as your map shows, broad coverage that everyone in the United States has equal availability of service.
Yeah, indeed. And one of the things that I found striking and important as a result of the speech where you and I met was the density of users, in urban versus rural. I don't want to mess up the numbers, but I think it was something like in rural areas, it's like 12 people per mile, or, some very low number, compared to 10,000 per mile or something. Can you help our audience understand some of the unique challenges and opportunities associated with the notion of density and coverage?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is definitely something that I talked about. And I think you and I talked about as well, that the cost of the infrastructure to be able to provide services in rural America, just not enough population density there for these companies to be able to get their investment back. So many of them are cooperatives, which is a very unique thing for many people that may listen to this. What do you mean I own, by owning the phone, I own a percentage of this company? But indeed, to get that type of ability to provide that service, they need to do something other than just focus on the bottom line. They needed a cooperative type of a setup in rural America to be able to do that type of a thing. So you've got all those factors working together, but I think wireless has been a bit of a game changer, because now, instead of having to there's still obviously wires, and I think Keith and Scott can clearly talk about that a lot more than the insurance guy can. But the bottom line is there's still wires involved, but wireless allows some of these companies that couldn't focus on that last mile and population density being enough to fund themselves, the ability to put up a tower or put some equipment on somebody's tower and reach enough people that it makes sense. But population density, definitely an issue when you start looking at the cost factors.
You did. And, Scott, he said something very interesting here about the notion of security, within the 5G ecosystem, within wireless technology. Maybe you could share with our audience your perspective on kind of how that's going. Is this stuff secure?
But it's all relative. Nothing's 100% secure. I always share with people. I think one fundamental thing that I think is important to realize, 5G is a lot of new stuff. And whenever there's new stuff, there's naturally vulnerabilities, and security is not always baked in or thought out fully. So it's not fully known how much a cyber criminal can exploit things. So just think about the infrastructure. If you compare 2G to 3G, 3G to 4G, a lot of the stuff at the base station, the cell towers, is very similar, and it's easier to upgrade. Now we switch over to 5G. 5G, what's really different, and I think part of the game changer, is that it's being used at higher frequencies, in particular the C-band, where a lot of this potential interference comes up in. The higher frequency, they're more susceptible to reflection and things bouncing around, and we have to understand it from the standpoint of lower frequency have a much larger wavelength. We think back in the days of cellular, 800 megahertz, right, has a much larger wavelength. What does that mean? It translates in simple terms. You can propagate the signal much, much further. So cell towers in the early days were really far apart, a couple miles apart. What's happening when we fast forward to 5G in 2022? Everything has to move closer because of the big difference. Higher the frequency, it's very tight wavelengths. So now you have to bring the cell towers or microcells, in a sense, much closer, proportional to the output power. So when we understand that the physics of it and the radio frequency aspect, you look at it a little bit differently. So it's a huge undertaking, in other words, is what I'm saying, for 5G, because now you've got to build out all this new infrastructure. That's a lot of work. And it's susceptible to different reflections and interference, different than its predecessors, 4G and 3G technology. So there's a lot of new things out there that we're all learning still. And I think, and hence that's what some of the problems are. Inherent with that is then obviously from a cybersecurity standpoint, there could be a lot of things, and I don't want to specify things that bad guys can do, but imagine things such as jamming or blocking or causing interference that could be catastrophic to
Right.
aviation, that could be catastrophic to how everything's tied together. When we think about, it's not just phones anymore. Our phones are what? Our phones also have Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, near field communication. A lot of them now are going to be getting the addition of satellite. So when you add in this giant, 5 or 6 different frequencies chunks, all in a most powerful handheld computer you can ever imagine, it's pretty impressive. And you look at what companies like Samsung, like Apple and others have done, it blows my mind. The amount of power that we can get out of our phone is unbelievable. So credit to the companies as they advance it. Sometimes they're advancing phones and technology faster than they can update because of the government and things, spectrum through the FCC, working with other agencies like the FAA and things like that. It's amazing any of it even works. But I am blown away to see what we can now accomplish in this next generation of 5G. And I think Keith pointed to it, which is really impressive. The speed element is impressive. But on top of that, I think about the latency, low latency. When you're handling lots of data, which is very important in 5G. In fact, I think that's probably one of the most pivotal things. Lots of data, you have to keep it secure, number one. But it allows you to now handle things like autonomous cars, smart factories, cloud robotics, all of these new emerging technologies that we all want to embrace and all the phone manufacturers want to embrace. 5G for the first time is allowing it to happen. That to me is exciting. The cybersecurity side, I'm always a little hesitant to, put the flag in the ground and say it's safe. They're doing better at it. There's more encryption. It is a lot harder to hack into phones such as a 5G. And I always tout to people, hey, Wi-Fi is real easy to hack into. A 4G LTE phone, very hard to hack into. So hopefully 5G will benefit for some of that complexity, making it difficult for hackers to really exploit some of the vulnerabilities. They still will, but it's getting better and better. And that's the beauty of it.
Indeed, and Keith, I think you're in a unique position to opine on that. I mean, you're involved with the Knox system. That's spelled Knox, and you're very steeped in this matter of cybersecurity. And what do you think about what Scott just said?
Oh, I think Scott's 100% right. If you watch the Spider-Man series movies, great power comes great responsibility, and it's exactly what's happening here. First and foremost, to Scott's point, you're going to light up a whole new generation of endpoints, and we know from the introduction of a laptop to the introduction of the first smartphone, these endpoints become major vulnerability points. And when they have the power, I mean, most cell phones, this Fold 3 has probably more power than most people's laptops do or have in the last 10 years. So when you take something that small with a mic, with a camera, with storage capabilities of up to a terabit, and you put it into a high speed mode where everywhere it travels, it's going to have potentially at some point 20 bytes per second communication. You can see what could happen if you don't take the security serious. Now, securing the networks, definitely to Scott's point, has to be done. But then it also becomes the responsibility, whether it's a corporation or an individual user, of how they secure that endpoint, because it's not only the data that resides on the endpoint, it's the access it will have to, as well as the communication it can establish, where they can hear, see, and communicate, whether you know it or not. Now, the good news is when you open up that kind of pipe, you also give the security components the same ability to run in a much more efficient and higher manner. So when Scott mentions encryption, for example, you can now start to delve into some of the encryption algorithms that have been talked about, tested as they start to grow into a whole other level that maybe a device couldn't have supported, or the communication was too weak to support. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. Yes, it gives the bad actors major opportunity, but it also gives the good actors a strength and ability, if they use it right, to put something in place. I think that could be as secure. Now, just to finish up to your point, Gary, in my experiences, I started my career in cybersecurity. When I started my cybersecurity career, I started in 2000 selling data at rest. That was where I really got in as a sales engineer. What was funny about that story was when laptops came out in 91, everybody worried about network security when they went online, but nobody thought about the physical security of the device.
Right.
So you saw there was antivirus, there were personal firewalls, there were VPNs all throughout the 90s coming out. And I think it was Dell that might have been one of the first ones that partnered with Absolute Software, and they started to put in like BIOS protections, and they started to put in this ability like to LoJack trace. I think it was called CompuTrace was the product, so you could track devices. But there was an inherent flaw in the technology where at the beginning of when you power the device on, all the BIOS gives you is information you can open up the box and look at, who made the hard drive and so forth. But it's really what happens in the bootloader that gives you the data of how to penetrate that machine, of where certain bytes on the hard drive might sit with your user groups and names and so forth. So in 2000, 2001, data at rest became the first, hey, we have to encrypt the entire device, and we have to put a strong authentication at a pre-boot level so that if the physical device falls into the wrong hands, they can't compromise it and impersonate you. Then cell phones came out with smartphones in 2007, the first iPhone, and in 2009 with the Android. And what you find out is they make the exact same mistake as the PC manufacturers. They do everything on the network, but they do nothing to protect, if I get a hold of your device, what I can do with it. So I think it's Knox, which I was a part of, which was one of the first ever, when it was announced in 2012 and released in 13, that actually looked at how do we put security at a hardware level, and how do we do a pre-boot authentication, and how do we encrypt everything end to end. And now it's becoming the standard. I mean, almost all smartphone manufacturers, this is something they have to consider, especially if they want to do business in the enterprise. It's why BlackBerry lasted as long as they did in the enterprise, even though they refused to go to 4G and they didn't believe anybody wanted a smartphone. They stayed in there because of their security. And now we're seeing on January 4th that changing as well for them. So yeah, I think to your question, I would say from my experience, it's multifaceted. It's hardware-based security, software-based security. It's recognizing that these endpoints that are about to light up your car, maybe your light bulb in your living room, whatever you're starting to put on the grid, all open up a new vector. And there's a kind of a responsibility I think the manufacturers have to take. And then there's a responsibility on either the administrators or the users, if not in tangent, to respect and understand what a communicational device on this type of network could represent.
Indeed, and that's a perfect segue to you, Peter. So let's assume that folks that take reasonable cybersecurity precautions in the way that Keith just described. But inevitably, as Scott said, criminals are clever. So what about the role of cyber insurance in all this?
Yeah, thanks. Scott and Keith just really took me on a roller coaster ride of emotions. Honestly, there's something good, there was something bad. They gave me something to think that, hey, this is good, and then that they pulled it away. But for cyber insurance, it's part of a risk management tool. It's not the only one, and unfortunately, many people look at it as the tool. And our role is to try to bridge that gap, provide that financial security when IT solutions or contractual obligations and solutions don't work the way that they should, and the company ends up finding themselves in a breach or a hack or something else that's happened, and lo and behold, they need someone to support it. The one thing that I think the insurance industry is starting to do better is provide what we'll call value added services that provide additional protection, but generally those types of things are coming from third party providers. And when you go back to folks like us and you say, can you tell me a little bit more about that? We're still not those experts. It's going to be difficult for us to be that, because we all have our areas of expertise, and ours is insurance, and it's risk transfer, and it's assumption of risk, and things like that. So for me to become an IT person, it just doesn't make sense. I need the Scotts, the Keiths of the world. I need to form partnerships with them so that I can give my customers the latest, greatest tools. And the challenge for us is finding the best of these people that we can partner with, because there are a lot of firms out there that tell us what they do and how great it is, and it sounds good, but we've got to do a lot of vetting to really provide solid solutions beyond insurance and provide that risk management, loss prevention type stuff that you're speaking of.
And one of the interesting things, Scott, I'm sure you know a lot about this, is just from a fiduciary standpoint, being able to show that you have cyber insurance, or the discipline series of precautionary measures, compliance, if you will, should improve an organization's overall cybersecurity posture, right, Scott?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really brilliant point you make, Gary, because I think the early days of cyber security insurance, unfortunately, there were too many insurers that quickly signed people up and didn't have maybe the knowledge base to properly explain what the risks were. And now the focus, I think, has shifted a little bit more now that it probably hit a lot of insurance companies, especially with the wave of ransomware attacks. And I spoke recently at a cyber insurance liability summit. And to that point, we talked a lot about that. So there you had cybersecurity experts, and you had insurance companies and lawyers kind of all in the same building. It was a fascinating conversation, but I learned a ton of things from outside of the world of cybersecurity. And one of the things is really, to Peter's point, there wasn't enough knowledge there. So now they are working and partnering up with third parties to come in and perhaps perform vulnerability assessment, penetration testing. In other words, raise up the vulnerabilities so they make it crystal clear, and everybody in the organization sees, here's the weak spots, let's shore them up, and let's go forward to make sure that we do have that good cyber posture so we don't fall victim to a breach. And that's good then for the company, obviously, but it's also good for the insurance industry, so they're not paying out these claims and losing a ton of money on it. But the education, I think, wasn't there. It's starting to get there now, and that's really important. One thing I always look at, and it was mentioned before, it's really, cyber insurance is really about kind of managing your risks. And I agree with that in the standpoint, most companies that don't have cyber insurance, they tend to not have good cybersecurity policies. Once you're paying premiums for something and you get the education, you really start implementing those things and you stay safe. That's what's really important. Even my company, I look as an example. We had our company looked at from a vulnerability assessment for penetration testing. And yes, we have cybersecurity insurance. There were flags after we internally looked at it that popped up from an outside third party independently, said, oh, by the way, Scott, did you know you had a weakness here, here, and here? I was blown away. But that's what happened. We're too close to the problem. And I think that third party assessment, when they come in on a regular basis, allows you to really perform well and work in conjunction with a good cybersecurity policy. So it's got to work in tandem, all three of those things, to be effective and ongoing.
Indeed. I mean, there's so many amazing things that you're talking about. We'll have to have you on the show again to unpack some of this. Before we leave, I know, Keith, you have a hard stop in a few minutes. I do just want to pop up something that happened today, which is, the complexity of two intergovernmental agencies. You have the FAA being quite concerned because of potential conflict with the spectrum and avionics and things like that. And just even today, there were some international carriers that said they're going to be decreasing or stopping flights to certain airports because of the proximity of the 5G towers to airports and the potential of interfering in flight safety. What do you think about that, Keith?
Yeah, it's scary. When we were implementing 5G, especially on the carrier side, this is going back 5 years when we started the conversation, they were trapping 8 terabits of data per flight, every flight. The issue was, if you ever noticed when you were waiting to board a flight a few years back and they would say it's still being cleaned or it's still getting maintenance, half the time they were bullshitting you, they were lying to you just because they were transferring 8 terabits of data on a Wi-Fi connection as the plane just got to the gate, and it took time. In a 5G world, as the plane's starting to make its landing, 5G can take super high speed communication and jump tower to tower without latency. So, and there's videos on this where you can see them going over hundreds of miles an hour and they're transferring in less than a second. So the data from the 8 terabits will start coming in the moment the plane hits the ground, if it's in an area that can handle that kind of bandwidth. And so then that helps the airlines for efficiency and speed, because they can take that whatever terabit they're up to now data that they've been recording all throughout the plane. And some of that recording is like who's sitting where, where's the dense population of the plane, who's ordering what foods and drinks. These are important things to the airlines that they need to understand and data crunch. But from a security level, it becomes a whole nother issue. I did want to add one thing on the security before we go too. We've been talking a lot about administrative training and executive training. The biggest threat is internal. That is the most expensive threat. If you look at all the different threats that are happening around the world, you take a Snowden or somebody who's inside and they decide they want to do something wrong or they want to do something harsh, it's the most dangerous. To me, the training and the supervision has to happen all throughout the organization, and that's where it's hard. And a 5G device in any level of your corporation, if that individual is not trained, they become one of your biggest threats, whether it's on purpose or if it's just by accident or mistake. And so that's where I think the one level that doesn't get addressed enough, you can get the insurance, you can bring in the third parties. It's really educating it down everywhere throughout your organization that you're going to entrust something as powerful as a 5G device so that they understand and respect that they play a role and that there's a part of it that they have to somewhat understand, no matter how technical they are. Because if they do make mistakes, they can be extremely costly. If not, for some companies, especially small businesses, it could mean the end. So this airline scenario is just an example of where I think you can see how dangerous threats can be. But from my perspective, the stories I was just trying to tell you is that on the airlines, they have a massive amount of data they're transferring. On an individual level, you may have access to data on a massive level or provide information that gives access to your corporate networks or servers. And so I'm curious to see if you have any points on the training side of that, because that's where I think a lot of companies are failing.
We're going to go to Peter to answer that question. But before that, Keith, how does our audience get more information about some of the interesting stuff you're doing?
Yeah, we have our SamsungKnox.com website. That's a great place for where you'll hear from Samsung's security posturing and so forth. And then we also have a 5G entire dedicated area that you can go to. If you can just Google Samsung 5G. It'll talk about the tech we're using, how we're doing it, where it's being used. There's a great YouTube video on a racetrack showing cars with phones equipped, taking all this data while they're riding around the track over 100 miles an hour and how fast it's transmitting. So there's a lot of information, but thank you, Gary. Yeah, it'd be online, Samsung.com or SamsungKnox.com.
And so, Peter, what do you think about that insider threats?
Yeah, absolutely. And Before I touch that, let me talk the 5G and the airplane piece. Talk about insurance worlds colliding. This is cyber. This is what we're concerned about. But a component of a cyber policy is a contingent bodily injury property damage, and it's slowly introduced itself into the policy over the last 12 months. And now it takes truly bodily injury that occurs because of an event. And we start talking about these services and potential hackers and the amount of data flying around. Could something like that come in? And now our insurance world isn't just concerned about the data breach, but now we're concerned about the bodily injury that occurs as well. But yeah, Keith, great point about the internal training. It's something we can never see enough of as an insurance company. But the reality of what we deal with now, again, the majority of my customers, we get tech all the way to huge telecommunications companies down to the smaller ones, but the smaller ones in particular, they're seeing this funding coming out for wired services, for the high-speed broadband, and they're struggling to be able to get that job done. Independent contractors, very difficult for them to find. So they're struggling with that. They're struggling with things that the insurance industry is now pressing upon them, that someone like Scott might go, wow, you mean they don't have multi-factor authentication on their email and their networks? Well, no, they didn't. So now we're forcing them to do that as well. And then on top of it, you're throwing out, when do they train their employees? They're telling us that there's just not enough hours in the day to do the things they've got to do. And we're telling them, hey, training, to Keith's point, perfect point, is something you've got to do. It's got to be in that top priority as well. But of course, we've got to understand it's a production-based world, unfortunately, and production sometimes comes at the cost of security. And that's a battle that I think we need a really good cyber hero to come in and fight for us to really push the right part. How was that as a great ending?
Good plug. Well, even better ending. How does our audience get more information about, you and your organization?
Yeah, you just go on any search engine and put in Telecom Insurance Group. We're updating our website. We'll have a new one out in a couple of months. So that one's a little dated at this point, but it's got a ton of information there, contact information as well. And always happy, tech, telecom, anybody. I love the insurance world. I'm one of those insurance geeks. Happy to speak with anyone at any point in time and try to help them out. That's kind of the insurance hero side. So thanks, Gary.
And you're pretty funny for an insurance person. I mean, So speaking of funny, Scott, you have the last word.
Yeah, maybe just to wrap up the one point on the airline and the potential interference there, because nobody seems to be reporting or talking about the problem. They're all talking about whose fault it is and when will be resolved. But the fundamental problem is, I guess, the pilots, they're worrying about 5G signals from cell towers. Cell towers are always transmitting, and obviously the close proximity, again, because the way signals propagate, as I talked about, the potential for interference with the radio altimeters, which is needed, landing a plane and taking off a plane, bad weather. And I look at part of the big problem should also be pointed at FAA and the airline industry. The airline industry, if they have older altimeters and equipment, avionics that are decades old, 30, 40 years old, they actually have bandpass filters that are not as sharp. In other words, it allows the adjacent spectrum to get in there and cause potential interference.
Whoa.
Nobody's talking about the problem. They're all pointing to the carrier. So it's kind of ironic that Verizon and AT&T kind of backed off a little bit and said, okay, we won't go live full steam ahead. But yet the fault kind of lies on both sides, a combination of FAA, airline industry, FCC from the regulation standpoint. Unfortunately, as usual, carriers get blamed and the phone manufacturers get the brunt of it, the blame, which isn't right. I don't understand that, but that's just the reality. So I always like to at least balance the argument out there and say all of these parties have to work together to make 5G work and to make 5G stay secure. But ultimately, I think they do have to upgrade a lot of the older avionics that are on the airplanes to make everything work. I don't think that the proposal of making a 2-mile buffer away from airports permanently makes any sense. 5G is needed in the airports. It's needed for consumers, but also needed to make planes work and to take off, to some of the points that Keith made. And then a brief about myself. If you want to find out more about myself in the world of cybersecurity, simply my name, scottschober.com. And then my company is bvsystems.com. And thanks again, Gary, for all the great stuff that you're doing, and also yourself there, Keith and Peter. Glad to be on with you.
Indeed. So on behalf of a grateful digital universe, thanks to all of you for who you are and what you do, and most importantly, why you do it. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Take care.